Part 2. Strange Moments. 1. Bruno lost control of the car just outside Poitiers. The Peugeot 305 skidded across the expressway and hit the guardrail, spun 180 degrees, righted itself, then stopped. Christ, he muttered numbly. Jesus fucking Christ. A Jaguar hurtled toward him, doing 220 kilometers. The driver braked sharply and swerved, narrowly missing the other guardrail, then drove off, leaning on his horn. "Bastard!" screamed Bruno, climbing out and shaking his fist. "Fucking bastard!" Then he got back into his car, made a U-turn, and continued on his way. The Lieu de Changement was founded in 1975 by a group of 68 veterans. In fact, they were more spirit of 68, since none of them had actually been involved in the riots. It was just south of Cholet, on a vast estate scattered with pine forests that belonged to one of the members' parents. Their plan, inspired by the liberal values of the early 70s, was to create an authentic utopia, a place where the principles of self-government, respect for individual freedom, and true democracy could be practiced in the here and now. The Lieu was not a commune, but had the more modest aim of providing a place where like-minded people could spend the summer months living according to the principles they espoused. It was intended that this haven of humanist and democratic feeling would create synergies, facilitate the meeting of minds, and, in particular, as one of the founding members put it, provide an opportunity to get your rocks off. Just before Cholet Sud, Bruno took the exit off the expressway and drove for 10 kilometers along country roads. The map was not very clear, and he felt hot. It was pure chance, he thought, that he finally saw the sign. In large, multicolored letters it read, Lieu du Changement, and underneath, I am properly free, when all the men and women about me are equally free. Michel Bakunin. On the right, 2 teenage girls were walking up a path that led to the sea and dragging a plastic duck. The sluts were wearing nothing under their t-shirts. Bruno watched them as they passed. His cock ached. Wet t-shirts, he thought solemnly, were a wonderful thing. The girls turned off the road. They were clearly heading to the nearby campsite. He parked the 305 and walked over to a small wooden hut with a welcome sign. Inside, a woman of about 60 sat in the lotus position. Her thin, wrinkled breasts hung over her thin cotton tunic. Bruno felt sorry for her. She gave him a big, somewhat stilted smile. "Welcome to the Lieu de Changement," she said at last. She smiled broadly again. Was she demented? Have you got your reservation form?" Bruno took his papers out of his wallet. "Perfect," muttered the hag, still smiling like a half-wit. It was forbidden to drive cars within the grounds of the campsite, so he decided to work in stages. First, he would find a place to pitch his tent. Then he would get his things from the car. He had bought a tent from La Samaritain before setting off. Made in the People's Republic of China. 2/3 persons, 449 FF. The first thing Bruno noticed when he arrived in the clearing was the pyramid. It was 20 meters high and 20 meters along the base, exactly equilateral. The sides were constructed of glass panes and heavy wood frames. The dying sun glinted on some of them, while through others it was possible to see the internal framework of levels and partitions, also constructed of dark wood. It was intended to symbolize a tree. In the center, a large cylinder housed the central staircase. A stream of people, some alone, others in small groups, some dressed, others naked, was leaving the building. With the sunset flaring through the long grass, the whole scene looked like a science fiction movie. Bruno observed the scene for 2 or 3 minutes, then took his tent under his arm and started up the first hill. The land was hilly and wooded with clearings here and there. The ground was carpeted with pine needles, and there were communal sanitary facilities at regular intervals. No plots were marked out. Bruno started to sweat, and he had gas. He'd eaten too much at the rest stop. He was finding it difficult to think clearly, but he knew that the choice of where to pitch his tent could make all the difference in the success of his stay. He was concluding as much when he noticed a clothesline strung between two trees. An evening breeze moved gently through the panties that had been hung out to dry. It might be a good idea to camp here, he thought, since it's easy to get to know your neighbors when camping. Not necessarily to fuck them, just to get acquainted. It was a start. He put down the tent and began to study the instructions. The French translation was abominable, the English not much better. He assumed that the other European languages were just as bad. Fucking chinks. What the hell did upturn the demi-poles to stable the dome mean? He was standing, staring hopelessly at the diagrams, when a sort of squaw appeared, dressed in a miniskirt of animal pelt, her large breasts dangling in the twilight. "Just got here?" the apparition asked. "Need a hand setting up your tent?" "I'll be okay," he said in a strangled voice. "I'll be okay, thanks. It's very good of you," he whispered. He had the impression this was a trap. Moments later, a wailing erupted from the neighboring wigwam. Where the hell had they bought this thing? Or had they made it themselves? The squaw ran off, returned with two little brats, one on each hip, and rocked them gently. They screamed louder. The squaw's brave trotted up, his cock dangling in the breeze. He was about 50, a stocky guy with long grey hair and a beard. He took one of the little monkeys in his arms and started tickling it. Disgusting. Bruno moved a little way off. That was a close call. With little monsters like that, he wouldn't get a wink of sleep. She was obviously breastfeeding, the cow. Nice tits, though. He walked a couple of meters away from the wigwam, but didn't want to stray too far from the panties. They were delicate, lacy, and transparent, and he couldn't imagine they belonged to the squaw. He finally found a spot between two Canadian girls, cousins, sisters, school friends, and set to work. It was almost dark by the time he had finished. In the half-light, he went back to get his suitcases. He met a number of people on the way, both couples and singles, and quite a few single women in their 40s. At regular intervals, there were signs nailed to the trees reading, "Mutual Respect." He walked up to one of them. Underneath was a small dish full of condoms conforming to French specifications. Below, there was a white plastic trash can. He stepped on the pedal and turned on his flashlight. The trash was mostly full of empty beer cans, but there were also used condoms. That's reassuring, thought Bruno. It looks like this place is humming. The trip back was difficult. He was out of breath, and the suitcase handles cut into his hands. He had to stop halfway up. Some people were circulating, the beams from their flashlights crossing in the darkness. There was still a lot of traffic on the coast road. The Dynasty on the way to Saint-Clément had a topless night, but he didn't feel up to it. He stood motionless for half an hour. This is my life, thought Bruno. I'm watching the car's headlights through the trees. When he got back to his tent, he poured himself a whiskey and jerked off slowly, flicking through a copy of Swing. Pleasure is a right, having bought a copy at the service station near Angers. He had no intention of really replying to any of the small ads. He couldn't hack a gangbang or a sperm fest. The women seeking single men were generally looking for black guys, and in any case, he did not come close to the minimum size they required. Issue after issue, he came to the conclusion that his cock was too small for the porn circuit. In general, however, he was not unhappy with his body. The hair transplant had taken well. Luckily, he'd found a good surgeon. He worked out regularly and, frankly, thought he looked good for 42. He poured another whiskey, ejaculated on the magazine, and fell asleep, almost content. 2. A 13-hour flight. The lieu de changement rapidly ran into the problem of aging. In the 80s, young people found its ideals dated. There were theatre workshops and massage therapy, but it basically was a campsite. The accommodations and facilities were not up to resort standards. Apart from that, The anarchic spirit of the place made it difficult to control access and collect payments. Its finances, which had always been precarious, became even more problematic. Their first response, a decision passed unanimously by the founding members, was to establish preferential rates for the young, but this did not prove sufficient. At the annual board meeting in the beginning of the 1984 fiscal year, Frédéric Le Dontec made a proposal that turned out to be the lieu's salvation. He suggested that business was the leisure industry of the 1980s. Each of them had acquired valuable experience in humanist therapy, Gestalt, rebirth, walking on hot coals, transactional analysis, Zen meditation, communication skills. Why not invest that experience in developing a series of residential courses aimed at businesses? After fierce debate, the proposal was adopted. Once it was accepted, work began on building the pyramid, together with 50 bungalows, basic but comfortable, where visitors could stay. At the same time, the founders organized an extensive mailing, targeting human resources directors in multinational companies. Some of the more left-wing of the founders found this transition difficult to accept. After a brief internal power struggle, the lieu ceased to be an association under the Act of 1901 and became a publicly traded corporation in which Frédéric Le Dontec was principal shareholder. After all, it was his parents' land, and Crédit Mutuel in Charente-Maritime seemed willing to back the project. 5 years later, the Lieu de Changement had an excellent client list: the National Bank of Paris, IBM, the Ministry of Finance, the Paris Transit Authority, Bourgeois Telecommunications. Inter- and intra-company courses were offered year-round, and the campsite, maintained principally for reasons of nostalgia, accounted for less than 5% of the company's annual turnover. Bruno woke with a crippling headache and no illusions. He had heard about the place from a secretary who had been on a personal development, positive thinking course at 5,000 francs a day. He had asked her for the brochure. Friendly, open-minded, liberal, he got the picture. But one statistic at the bottom of the page attracted his attention. In July to August of the previous year, 63% of visitors to the Lieu de Changement were female. That was almost 2 women to every man, an excellent ratio. He decided to check it out and booked a week there in July, especially as camping would be cheaper than going to a Club Med. Of course, he could guess what sort of women went there: deranged old lefties who were probably all HIV positive. But still, with 2 women to every man, he stood a chance. If he worked it properly, he might even bag 2. The year had started well from a sexual point of view. The influx of girls from Eastern Europe had meant prices had dropped. For 200 francs, you could get a little personal relaxation, down from 400 francs some months earlier. Unfortunately, he crashed his car in April, and the repairs were expensive. Worse still, it had been his fault. The bank started to squeeze him, and he had to economize. He lifted himself on his elbow and poured himself his first whiskey. The copy of Swing was still open at the same page. A guy who kept his socks on, his name was Hervé, was thrusting his cock toward the camera with visible effort. Not my thing, thought Bruno. Not at all. He put on a pair of boxer shorts and walked toward the shower block. After all, he thought hopefully, the squaw from last night was more or less fuckable. In fact, her big, sagging breasts were perfect for a tit job. It had been 3 years since his last time. Bruno had always liked jerking off between a girl's tits, but whores didn't really go for it. Was it the fact that you came in their faces that turned them off? Did it require more time and personal investment than a blowjob? Whatever, a tit job wasn't generally on the menu, so it was difficult to get girls to do it. They seemed to think of it as personal. Often, when he requested one, Bruno had to make do with a hand job or maybe a blowjob. He sometimes managed to coax a tit job out of a girl, but as far as Bruno was concerned, there were not nearly enough to go around. He arrived at the shower block, body space 8. He had more or less resigned himself to the women being old and decrepit, and was taken aback to see teenagers. There were 4 of them near the showers, all between 15 and 17, opposite the sinks. 2 of them wore bikini bottoms and waited as the other 2 played under the shower like otters, chatting and laughing and splashing each other. They were completely naked. The scene was indescribably graceful and erotic. He did not deserve such a thing. His cock was hard in his boxer shorts. With one hand he took it out and pressed himself against the sink as he cleaned between his teeth with a toothpick. He stabbed himself in the gum, removed the bloody toothpick. The head of his penis tingled unbearably. It was hot and swollen, a drop forming at the tip. One of the girls, graceful and dark-haired, stepped out of the shower, grabbed a towel, and began to contentedly pat her young breasts dry. A little redhead slipped off her swimsuit and took her place under the shower. Her pussy hair was golden blonde. Bruno moaned a little and was beginning to feel dizzy. In his head, he could imagine walking over, taking his shorts off, and waiting by the showers. He had every right to go and wait to take a shower. He imagined himself beside them, his cock hard, saying something like, "Is the water hot?" The showers were 50 centimeters apart. If he took a shower next to the red-headed girl, she might accidentally brush against his prick. At this thought, he felt increasingly dizzy and had to hold on to the porcelain sink. At the same instant, 2 boys arrived, laughing a little too loudly. They were wearing black shorts with fluorescent stripes. Suddenly, Bruno's hard-on was gone. He put his penis back into his shorts and returned to picking at his teeth. Later, still in a state of shock, he went down to the breakfast tables. He sat apart from the others and spoke to no one. As he chewed his vitamin-enriched cereal, he thought about the Faustian nature of sexual pursuit, its vampirism. For example, Bruno thought people are wrong to talk about homosexuals. He had never, or very rarely, met a homosexual. On the other hand, he knew a great many pederasts. Some pederasts, thankfully very few, prefer little boys. They wind up in prison for a long stretch, and no one ever talks about them again. Most pederasts, however, are attracted to youths between 15 and 25. Anyone older than that is, to them, simply an old dried-up asshole. Watch 2 old queens together, Bruno liked to say. Watch them closely. They may be fond of each other. They may even be affectionate, but do they really want each other? No. As soon as some tight 15 to 25-year-old ass walks past, they will tear each other apart like panthers. Each will rip the other to pieces just for that tight little ass. So Bruno thought. In this, as in many things, so-called homosexuals had led the way for society as a whole, Bruno figured. Take him, for example. He was 42 years old. Did he want women his own age? Absolutely not. On the other hand, for young pussy wrapped in a miniskirt, he was prepared to go to the ends of the earth. Well, to Bangkok at least. Which was, after all, a 13-hour flight. 3. Sexual desire is preoccupied with youth, and the progressive influx of ever younger girls onto the field of seduction was simply a return to the norm, a restoration of the true nature of desire, comparable to the return of stock prices to their true value after a run on the exchange. Nonetheless, women who turned 20 in the late 60s found themselves in a difficult position when they hit 40. Most of them were divorced and could no longer count on the conjugal bond, whether warm or abject, whose decline they had served to hasten. As members of a generation who, more than any before, had proclaimed the superiority of youth over age, they could hardly claim to be surprised when they, in turn, were despised by succeeding generations. As their flesh began to age, the cult of the body, which they had done so much to promote, simply filled them with an intensifying disgust for their own bodies, a disgust they could see mirrored in the gaze of others. The men of their generation found themselves in much the same position, yet this common destiny fostered no solidarity. At 40, they continued to pursue young women, with a measure of success, at least for those who, having skillfully slipped into the social game, had attained a certain position, whether intellectual, financial, or social. For women, their mature years brought only failure, masturbation, and shame. Dedicated exclusively to sexual liberation and the expression of desire, the lieu de changement naturally became a place of depression and bitterness. Farewell to limbs entwined in a clearing under the full moon. Farewell to the quasi-Dionysian spectacle of oiled bodies glistening under the midday sun. That, at least, is what the 40-somethings muttered as they regarded their flaccid pricks and rolls of fat. In 1987, the first quasi-religious workshops appeared at the lieu. Christianity was excluded, of course, but a sufficiently nebulous exotic mysticism, for these rather weak-minded beings, dovetailed neatly with the cult of the body beautiful, which, against all sense, they continued to promote. There were still workshops on sensual massage and the liberation of the orgone, but interest in the esoteric, astrology, Egyptian tarot, chakras, boomed. There were encounters with the angel and courses on crystal healing. Siberian shamanism made a conspicuous debut when, in 1991, during the long initiation in a sweat lodge fired by sacred coals, an initiate died of heart failure. Tantric Zen, which combined profound vanity, diffuse mysticism, and sexual frottage, flourished. In a matter of years, the lieu, like many centers throughout France and Western Europe, became a relatively popular New Age institution, while maintaining its reputation as a 1970s-style hedonist's paradise, which became its unique selling point. After breakfast, Bruno retired to his tent. He considered masturbating. The image of the teenagers was still vivid, but finally decided against it. The enticing girls must be the offspring of the regiments of flower children he had passed around the lieu, so clearly some of the old hags had succeeded in reproducing after all. This realization plunged Bruno into vague, unpleasant reflections. He tore open the flap of his tent. The sky was blue. Small clouds floated like spatters of sperm between the pines. The day promised to be dazzling. He glanced at the program for the week. He had chosen option 1, creativity and relaxation. There was a choice of 3 workshops that morning: mime and psychodrama, painting in watercolors, and creative writing. Psychodrama, he decided, was best avoided. He had been there and done that on a weekend course in Chantilly, where he had watched 50-year-old social workers rolling around on the floor, whining for daddy to bring them their teddy bears. Painting sounded more interesting, but would probably be outdoors. Did he really want to squat among pine needles, insects, and God knows what else, only to turn out some crap? The woman who led the creative writing workshop had long black hair and a full, sensual mouth, outlined in carmine red, what he usually referred to as blowjob lips. She wore a black tunic and stretch pants. A good-looking woman, she had class. Probably just a slut, though, thought Bruno, crouching down in the ill-defined circle of disciples. To his right, a fat, sallow, grey-haired woman with thick glasses breathed noisily. She reeked of wine, and it was only 10:30. "To salute our collective presence," began the leader, "to salute the earth and the 5 ways, we will begin the workshop with the Hatha Yoga movement called the Sun Salutation." She followed this with a description of an unlikely posture. The wino on Bruno's right belched. "You look tired, Jacqueline," said the yogi. "You shouldn't do any exercise if you don't feel up to it. Lie down. The group will join you in a while." They all had to lie down while the teacher delivered a long, vacuous speech in the style of Contract Civil. "You are plunging into beautiful crystal water. You can feel it enveloping your limbs, flowing over your stomach. You give thanks to your mother, the earth. Confidently you press yourself to your mother, the earth. Feel your desire. You give thanks to yourself for giving you this desire." The dipso beside him belched regularly. Between burps, she exhaled with a great which presumably was intended to express her relaxation. The Karma Queen went on with her routine, conjuring Tellurian energies to revitalize the stomach and groin. After meandering through the 4 elements, and satisfied with her performance, she concluded, "Now that you have broken the barrier of the rational and made contact with your deepest desires, open yourself to the limitless power of the creative urge." "Urge, schmerge," fumed Bruno as, with difficulty, he got to his feet. The writing session was followed by a presentation in which each of them had to read what they had written. The only halfway decent babe in the whole workshop was called Emma, a fit little redhead wearing jeans and a t-shirt, who had written a completely inane poem about moon sheep. Most of the group were positively oozing with rapture at having made contact with Mother Earth, Father Son, and family. At last, it was Bruno's turn to read. Mournfully, he intoned, "Taxi drivers are fucking cunts. They never stop, the little runts." "You feel like that," said the yogi. "You feel like that because you haven't mastered your negative energy. I can feel deep, powerful desires within you. We can help you, here and now. Let's all stand and focus the energies of the group." Everyone stood, joined hands, and formed a circle. Reluctantly, Bruno took the hands of the old bag on his right and a revolting little bearded man who looked like Kavana. Her whole being focused but calm, the yogi uttered a long Om, and they were off, everyone droning Om as if they'd been doing it all their lives. Bruno was gamely trying to join in the resounding harmony, when he suddenly felt himself pitch to the right. Hypnotized, the fat hag was toppling like a stone. He let go of her hand, but was unable to break his fall, and found himself on his knees in front of the old bitch, now flat on her back and writhing on the mat. The yogi interrupted her meditation and said calmly, "That's it, Jacqueline. Just lie down if you feel like it." The two of them seemed to know each other. The second writing exercise was a little better. Inspired by his fugitive vision that morning, Bruno penned the following poem. "I'm tanning my dick, hair on my prick, down by the pool, hair on my tool. I swear I found God in body space 8. He has a great bod, but his hair is a state. What is our job? Hair on my knob, to praise him in song, hair on my dong." "It's humorous," said the yogi, her tone somewhat disapproving. "And mystical," theorized the drunk. "Mystical, but empty." What was he going to do? Bruno wondered. How long could he put up with this? Was it really worth the effort? When the workshop ended, he rushed back to his tent, not even stopping to try and talk to the little redhead. He needed a whiskey before lunch. Near his tent, he happened across one of the girls he had been eyeing at the showers. With a graceful movement which showed off her breasts, she reached up and took down the lacy panties she had hung out the night before. He felt as though he might explode, showering the campsite in a rain of fatty tissues. What had changed since his adolescence? He still had the same desires, with the knowledge that he probably could never satisfy them. A world that respects only the young eventually devours everyone. For lunch, she chose a Catholic. She was easy to spot. She wore a big iron cross around her neck. Besides, her heavy lower lids gave her eyes the fervour common to Catholics or mystics, though admittedly also to alcoholics. Long dark hair, pale complexion, a bit skinny but not bad looking. Facing her sat a girl with reddish blonde hair, the Swiss Californian type, 6 feet tall, perfect body, obscenely healthy. She was the leader of the Tantric Zen workshop. In fact, her name was Brigitte Martin, and she came from Créteil. She had been initiated into the mysteries of the Orient in California, where she had her breasts done and changed her name. Back in Créteil, she ran a class on Tantric Zen under the name of Shanti Martin. The Catholic was clearly impressed. At first, Bruno found it easy to join in their discussion, which seemed to be about macrobiotics. He had read up on wheat germ, but the conversation quickly turned to more religious themes, and soon he was lost. Could Jesus be subsumed into Krishna, or perhaps into some other deity? Was Rin Tin Tin more lovable than Lucky Luke's Rusty? Though Catholic, this woman had no time for the Pope. His medieval outlook, in her opinion, was hindering the spiritual evolution of the Western world. "You're right," said Bruno. "He's a retard." The judgment earned him a new respect from the others. "And the Dalai Lama can wiggle his ears," he said dolefully as he finished his tofu burger. Indefatigable, the Catholic got up before coffee was served. She didn't want to be late for her personal development workshop. The principles of yes, yes. "Ah, yes. Yes, yes is cool," said the Swiss Californian as she got up. "Thanks for the chat," said the Catholic, turning back with a smile. Anyway, he hadn't done too badly, Bruno thought, as he headed back to his tent. Talking to morons like that is like pissing in a urinal full of cigarette butts, like shitting in a toilet full of Tampax. Nothing gets flushed, and everything starts to sink. Space separates one skin from another. Words cross the space between one skin and another. Unheard, unanswered, the words hang in the air and begin to decay, to stink. That's the way it is. Seen like this, words could separate too. At the pool, he found a pool chair. The teenage girls danced around like idiots, shivering, hoping a boy might push them in. The sun was at its height. Slick, naked bodies moved across the expanse of blue. Without thinking, Bruno launched into a children's book, The Six Companions and the Gloved Man, Paul Jacques Bonzon's masterpiece, recently republished by the Bibliothèque Verte. In the unbearable glare of the sun, it was good to find himself back in the mists of Lyon, with his stalwart companion, Cappy the dog. The afternoon program offered a choice between sensitive gestalt massage, liberating the voice, and rebirthing in warm water. In theory, massage sounded the sexiest. He had a brief glimpse of liberating the voice as he walked up to the massage workshop. There were about 10 of them, very excited, jumping around to the directions of the tantric woman and screeching like startled turkeys. At the top of the hill, arranged in a circle, were trestle tables, each covered with a large towel. The students were naked. In the center of the circle, the instructor, a small dark-haired man with a slight squint, gave a brief history of sensitive Gestalt massage. Born out of Fritz Perls' Gestalt, or Californian massage, the method had evolved to integrate aspects of the sensual to become, in his opinion, the most complete form of massage. There were those at the lieu, he admitted, who did not share his point of view, but he did not wish to become polemical. Whatever the truth of it, and he would like to end on this note, there was massage, and then there was massage. In fact, one might say that no two massages were alike. Having finished his preamble, he began the demonstration by asking one of the women to lie on the table. "Feel the tension in your partner," he commented as he stroked her shoulders, his cock only centimeters from the girl's long blonde hair. "Harmony. It's all about harmony," he went on, pouring oil on her breasts. "You must respect the wholeness of the body." His hands slipped down her stomach. The girl closed her eyes and parted her thighs, clearly enjoying his work. "There you go," he concluded. "Now, I want you to work in pairs. Take your time, move around the space, get to know each other." Still hypnotized by what he had just seen, Bruno was slow to react, though this was the crucial moment. You simply approached your partner of choice, smiled, and calmly asked her, "Would you like to work with me?" Everyone else seemed to know the drill, and in 30 seconds it was all over. Bruno looked around, panic-stricken, and found himself face to face with a hairy little man with dark hair and a thick penis. He had not realized there were only 5 girls for 7 guys. Thankfully, the other guy didn't look like a queer. Visibly furious, he lay down on his stomach without a word, rested his head on his arms, and waited. Feel the tension. Respect the wholeness of the body. Bruno poured more oil on, but couldn't get past the knees. The guy's body was stiff as a board. Even his buttocks were hairy. The oil was beginning to drip onto the towel. The guy's calves had to be saturated. Bruno looked up. Next to him, 2 men were lying on their backs. On his left, the man was having his pectorals massaged. The woman's breast swayed gently, his nose level with her pussy. The instructor's ghetto blaster pumped out synthesizer music. The sky was a perfect blue. All around him, oil-slick cocks were beginning to rise toward the light. Everything seemed intensely real. He could not bear it any longer. On the far side of the circle, the instructor was advising a couple on technique. Bruno grabbed his backpack and hurried off toward the pool, where it was clearly rush hour. On the nearby lawn, naked women lay chatting, reading, or simply taking the sun. Where should he sit? Towel in hand, he wandered erratically across the lawn, tottering, as it were, between the vaginas. He decided it was time to get off the fence when he spotted the Catholic talking to a dark-skinned, rugged little guy with bright eyes and dark curly hair. He made a vague sign of recognition. She did not notice, and flopped down nearby. "Hey, Karim," someone called to the dark-skinned man as he walked past. Karim waved and went on talking to the Catholic, who lay quietly on her back, listening. She had a pretty muff of curly black hair between her thighs. As they chatted, Karim gently kneaded his balls. Bruno rested his head on the grass and concentrated on the gentle world barely a meter away within the Catholic's pubic hair. He quickly fell asleep. On 14th December 1967, the government passed the Neuwirth Act on contraception at its first reading. Although not yet paid for by Social Security, the pill would now be freely available in pharmacies. It was this which offered a whole section of society access to the sexual revolution, which until then had been reserved for professionals, artists, and senior management, and some small businessmen. It is interesting to note that the sexual revolution was sometimes portrayed as a communal utopia, whereas in fact it was simply another stage in the historical rise of individualism. As the lovely word household suggests, the couple and the family would be the last bastion of primitive communism in liberal society. The sexual revolution was to destroy these intermediary communities, the last to separate the individual from the market. The destruction continues to this day. The steering committee of the Lieu de Changement regularly held dinner dances. For a place open to new spiritual ideas, this might seem surprising, but it only confirmed the dinner dance as the inevitable means of sexual selection in non-communist societies. As Frédéric Le Dantec pointed out, primitive societies also centered their feasts on dancing and the pursuit of collective trance. A bar and a sound system were installed on the lawn, and people gyrated in the moonlight into the small hours. For Bruno, this was a second chance. Actually, the teenagers at the camp rarely attended these occasions, preferring to go to local clubs. Bilboquet, Dynasty, 2001, and maybe Pirates, which hosted theme nights with foam parties, male strip shows, and porn stars. A handful of needle-dick dreamers stayed behind, spending their evenings in a tent, gently strumming an out-of-tune guitar while their peers despised them. Bruno felt a keen sympathy for these young men, but in the absence of girls he could never hope to attract, he would happily, to quote a reader of New Look he'd met in a café in Angers, stick his knob in any available hole. It was in this hope that he left his tent at 11, wearing white trousers and a blue polo shirt, and headed down to the source of the commotion. Glancing around the mass of dancers, he spotted Karim, who had abandoned the Catholic in favor of a ravishing Rosicrucian. She and her husband, both tall, staid, and slim, had arrived that afternoon. They seemed to be from Alsace. The husband had taken 4 hours to work out the arrangement of the numerous flaps and guy lines of their convoluted tent. Earlier, he had taken Bruno aside and initiated him into the hidden mysteries of the Rosy Cross. Eyes glittering behind his small round glasses, he looked every inch a zealot. Bruno listened without hearing. According to him, the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross had been founded in Germany, inspired by the work of the alchemists, but was intrinsically linked to Rhenish mysticism. It was obviously a cabal of queers and Nazis. You can stick your cross up your ass, Bruno thought, distractedly watching that of the man's beautiful wife out of the corner of his eye as she kneeled by the gas stove. Not to mention the rose, he added as she stood up, flashing her breasts, and called to her husband to come change the baby. In any case, now she was dancing with Karim. They made a strange couple, the stocky, cunning little man a good 15 centimeters shorter than this big Germanic beanpole. He chatted and smiled as they danced, as though he had forgotten why he had picked her up in the first place. Nevertheless, things seemed to be progressing. She smiled back and stared at him, clearly fascinated. Once she even laughed out loud. On the far side of the lawn, her husband was explaining the origins of the Rosicrucian Fellowship in Lower Saxony in 1530 to another potential convert. At regular intervals, his 3-year-old son, a blonde-haired, snot-nosed brat, screamed that he wanted to be put to bed. Once again, Bruno was faced with a slice of real life. He overheard 2 skinny, priestly individuals commenting on the rake's progress. "He's very expressive, very emotional, you see," said one. "On paper, he's out of his league. He's not good looking, he's got a beer belly, and he's a lot shorter than she is. But he's a charming bastard, and that makes all the difference." The other nodded, seeming to toy mournfully with an imaginary rosary. As he finished his vodka and orange juice, Bruno noticed that Karim had managed to inveigle the Rosicrucian onto a grass bank, one arm around her shoulders. Talking all the while, he slipped his other hand up her dress. She opened her legs for him. The Nazi slut, Bruno thought, as he walked away from the dancers. Just as he stepped out of the circle of light, he had a vision of the Catholic girl having her ass felt up by someone who looked like a ski instructor. He still had some cans of ravioli in his tent. Before heading back, in an act of pure desperation, he phoned to check his answering machine. There was one message. You're probably on vacation, said Michel's voice calmly. Call me when you get back. I'm on vacation too. Indefinitely.